All right, with that, I'm going to introduce you to our speaker today. Her name is Shannon Studden, and she is a program specialist 2 with Rural Health Innovation. She's a colleague of mine and has done some presentations for the development, network development grantees, and we're lucky to have her with us today to share her subject matter expertise on leading change. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Shannon.
Thanks, Angie, and welcome everybody. I'm really happy to be here working with Angie since I came here to RHI. I've heard a lot about the Allied Health Group and the work that you've been doing, so I'm really excited to be speaking with you today. So as you probably have heard before and seen, Rural Health Innovations, really what we're all about is connecting rural health organizations with innovations that enhance the health of rural communities. I'll talk a little bit about what we're going to talk about today, but first I just wanted to point out a few of the things that I've learned about you in preparation for this webinar. So I probably don't need to tell all of you that you're facing a lot of changes. This slide and the slide I'll move to next show just some examples of what you said during the grantee sharing session at the All Programs meeting in February and in some of your sustainability plans. So some of the things that were listed in your slides and in the sustainability plans were things like creating a culture of learning, developing capacity of local EMS to deliver classes, developing capacity of labs to provide hands-on components of educational programs, expanding relationships with healthcare facilities, and expanding or creating local or regional healthcare academies, workforce development committee, identifying services that will be discontinued following the grant period, which is coming up here, promoting collaboration, handing off leadership of the stakeholder group in the transition at the end of the grant period, developing a pilot program to provide transportation to healthcare appointments, finding solutions to barriers that came up during the grant period. And in addition, you're just generally facing things that go along with the end of the grant period. So your job might look different. You may be looking at working with different funders or a different revenue stream. Your organizational structure, your reporting relationships might be changing. And so at this point in the grant period, we thought it might be helpful just to share some insights and some strategies for managing through these changes. Leading not only yourself, but other people through the experience of change is, if you think about it, one of the most complex and challenging things that we can do in our professional life. The good news, though, is that as a group, you already have a track record of successfully leading groups through change. And these may be groups of people that you work closely with or people that you have had to develop relationships with throughout the course of the change initiatives that you've been working on. So, again, here are some of the things that you said you've already done. These are things that you shared during the All Programs meeting. So things, really big things, like creating a brand new bachelor's degree program, building relationships, increasing awareness, having some influence over educational partners about bringing programs in areas that they didn't exist before, expanding career academies, creating a new website, broadening scope, lots of education, which is obviously the nature of a lot of what you are doing. Helping folks pass exams and implementing training programs and academies and implementing a school-based health center management. So there's a lot of change under your belt already. So I encourage you, because there's so much change in this group, I just encourage you, even after the grant period is over, to continue to stay connected with each other and to call on each other as resources. As I imagine you know, some of the best advice you can really get comes from people who've been where you are and have worked some of the issues that you're facing. So here are our learning objectives for today. I kind of like to think of them in the form of questions we'll answer. So here are the questions we'll answer. Why do people react differently to change? How can we help others navigate the change process? And how can we manage our own emotions during the change process? We're going to focus on the experience of change and how to help yourselves and others through it as it's happening, rather than focusing on more formal steps to follow ahead of time. So we'll walk through a few things that you can think about and a few tools to use when you run into challenges throughout the course of a change process. Before we move on, I'd like to ask you to think of a current or an upcoming change or a recent change to hold in your mind as we go through today's content. So I'm going to pull up a poll window here. So you don't have to put your name and network if you prefer not to. Just answer the question. So take a minute and think about a change that you're currently part of, or if you can't think of a current one, just name one that recently occurred. And I'll give you a minute to put your answers in the poll window. So we've got a new senior administrator. An office relocation. Oh, that's interesting because we have an example of that coming up. A change in almost all committee members. That is complex, to say the least. Ooh, change the way we think about the services we provide to our members. That's a really tricky one, too. 90% leadership change within the last 2 years. Also very complex. Hard to keep up with, I imagine. So these are very different from each other, but also very complex. Even something that seems on the surface to be fairly straightforward, which is relocating to another facility, can carry with it a lot of underlying things that come up. So what I'll ask you to do is keep in mind the change that you identified, and also just be thinking about some of the things that other folks on the call have said, and because we're going to come back to this. Thanks for your responses. If you've ever read the book Switch, it's a book about managing change, and Chip and Dan Heath are brothers who wrote the book. They make a really interesting analogy. They say that whenever we're experiencing or driving change, our brains are operating on two levels, the rational side and the emotional side. And they liken the rational side, to a rider. So creating a plan, methodically directing activities toward the goal, all of that rational, all the stuff that happens in the rational part of our mind. A lot of the literature on managing change focuses on this rational side, the rider. So planning the initiative, identifying your milestones throughout the process, identifying potential roadblocks and ways that we can prevent them. But what's often overlooked is the emotional side, or in this analogy, the elephant. Change is a really emotional process. Even in things as fairly straightforward as relocating an office, there can be some emotions that play a part. So if you think about some of the changes you've been part of, you may have gone through some big changes like career transitions, changing in residence, something more narrow like implementing a new software system or getting a new boss. There's the logical, rational side that tells you the change either makes sense or it doesn't make sense, and it helps you kind of lay out a plan for carrying it out. But then there's the emotional side. So having to get out of your comfort zone, live with some uncertainty and some doubt, second guessing whether you made the right decision, all of that engages the emotional side of our brain. So if you look at this picture, the rider looks like he's in charge, but he's really pretty small compared to the elephant. And if there's disagreement between the two, the elephant's going to win every time. And the same thing happens when the rational and emotional parts of your brain are in conflict. The emotional side wins almost every time. So in our conversation today, we're certainly not going to ignore the rider. We'll talk about the importance of things like having a good reason for initiating a change and for creating clear goals. But we're really going to zero in on that elephant, or the emotional side. We can't successfully lead any change initiative without having a really good understanding of other people's elephants or other people's emotions, as well as our own. And what research is increasingly making clear is that when change efforts fail, it's often due to the elephant. It's our emotions or other people's emotions. But it's also the elephant who gets things done. There's a growing body of research about the impact that emotions have on many processes we have, historically thought of as rational. For example, there's been recent research that's found that providers' emotions can impact clinical decisions. There's been a lot of research in the past decade or so on the role that emotions play in our economic decisions. And we're learning that when it comes to money, we're not quite the rational beings that early economists thought we were. One interesting study recently found that not only will bad feelings affect how much we'll pay for something, but different bad feelings mean we'll pay different amounts. So we'll pay a different amount when we're sad versus when we're feeling disgusted. There's all kinds of really interesting research on there about how we make economic decisions. And in another study, nurses participating in a shared governance initiative picked up on and adopted emotions from their colleagues. So pleasantness, unpleasantness, motivation, demotivation. So they kind of they caught onto the emotions that their colleagues were feeling, and that impacted their perceptions of the change itself, whether it was legitimate, how willing they were to participate in it. So let's look for a minute at one way to look at the emotions people often experience over the course of a change. This curve may look familiar to you. It follows the consecutive stages of grief that were identified by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross back in the 1960s. And there's a growing body of research that's been conducted since then that supports the idea that the same pattern shows up in the emotions we experience during change. The stages are denial, which is kind of defined by a shock and feeling overwhelmed, or a feeling that it may not affect me or it may not happen at all. Then there's anger, which we can define as underlying pain that sometimes comes out in negative ways towards others. We'll talk a little bit more about what each of these can look like in a minute. Bargaining is another emotion on the change curve, so this kind of need to do some negotiation. There's depression, which is about a feeling of emptiness. We're not talking about clinical depression here, just a feeling of emptiness specifically in the context of the change. And there's acceptance, the acceptance of the changed reality, that the new reality is the permanent reality. You might notice this little orange trapdoor of despair at the bottom of the curve. Sometimes at this point it becomes so hard to deal with change that people just drop out. In this context, it could mean they quit their job or they ask for a reassignment. And if you've been through a really difficult change at work before, you may recognize this trapdoor. You may have considered leaving your job, or you may actually have done it. The process of change isn't always quite this neat or quite this well-defined, and studies have found that we can move backwards and forwards on this curve. But as you're going through a change and supporting yourself and you're supporting others as things progress, it can be helpful to remember that change actually often involves grief. There's a letting go of the past, there's the acceptance of a new reality, and even when change is positive, so even when people win the lottery, there's still a process of letting go of the past and adjusting to a new reality, and that always involves a little bit of grieving. There was a really interesting study done in 2015 by Anne Scheck-McIlerney, who's on the faculty of the medical school at Ohio State. And then she had a number of other research team members. They looked at the process of implementing an electronic health record in 6 different health systems across the United States, and looked in particular at the emotional experiences of physicians throughout the implementation. If you've ever been involved in a project like that, you might recognize these stages. Even if you've gone through such a software change in general, you might recognize these stages in yourself and other people. But in this study, they held focus groups with physicians, and then from the focus group data, they saw this very curve and the pattern of experiences described by the physicians. In the write-up of their study, the researchers included comments made by physicians illustrating every one of the stages along the curve. So here's an example of denial. One physician said, "It's probably been one of the most unsettling things I've seen for physicians throughout our entire system." And when you think about, physicians see a lot of unsettling things, and if they're defining the change in the way that we keep health records as one of the most unsettling things, that's a good sign that this is a pretty emotional transition for them. Physicians' denial is often followed by anger, as illustrated here. So another physician said, by the time you've actually done all that, your patient encounter is halfway over. And if you've been involved in implementing an electronic health record, this probably looks familiar to you. This is a common problem. You spend so much time in the software that you lose time with patients. Bargaining showed up. One physician was kind of on the fence, so can I just add a progress note? Do I have to have a full cover letter? There was depression, including evidence of the trapdoor of despair. So one of the physicians actually considered quitting medicine. It was so difficult. And there were comments illustrating acceptance. So this person said, I have all I need at my fingertips. It's a great system. And you might be looking at this and thinking that sounds really nice and neat. It's generally not as simple as this, and you're absolutely right. These processes are a lot messier than they look on this curve. But when you see or hear these kinds of things from people experiencing a change, it can be helpful to know that this is a normal part of the process. For example, you're leading a change and you're noticing angry reactions, that actually can be a good sign because it means that people are moving along the curve. They've gotten out of the denial process and the denial part of the curve, and they're a little bit upset about it. So the next time you're leading a change and you see angry people, you can pat yourself on the back. You're moving them right along. All right, I'm going to pull up another poll question. So think about the change that you identified earlier, whether it's one that's happening right now or one that just happened. And think about a person who's having a particularly hard time with the change. It may be you, who knows. But what part of the change curve are they stuck in? So right now we've got an even split in the now in the middle of the curve. We've got some bargaining, some depression, and one anger. So it looks like we're kind of in that middle zone. That's the good news is nobody's in denial, so we're moving them along the curve. All right, so what we'll do in a minute here is talk a little bit about what each of these look like, and we will look at some strategies for keeping people moving along the curve and addressing the emotional side of change. Thanks for your responses. Let's look at some of the reasons for different reactions to change. If you've ever gone through change as part of a group, or if you've led a group through change, you know that people respond to change in different ways. Sometimes these differences happen because of the circumstances, so things happening outside of the person. And sometimes the different responses can be due to differences in the characteristics of the individuals themselves. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. Different responses to change can be dependent on the amount of input that people have had during the planning process. So if, for example, you've created a new website to connect job seekers with employers, but as you developed your plan, you only got input from one of the major employers in your area, you're probably going to get less cooperation from representatives of the other employers. Responses to change can also depend on the level of understanding that each person has of both the need for the change and what can be expected as the process continues. So whoever put in there as their example, the office change, you have played right into my hand. I wish I could say that was the plan. But so thinking of an example, imagine that you've just been told your office is going to be moved to another building next month. You're much more likely to be comfortable with the change if you know the reason for the move and what you can expect between now and the move. You might be thinking this is a no-brainer, that of course people need to understand the reason for a change, but the fact is that we often assume that people understand a lot more than they do. This is something to be especially aware of when you're part of the group leading the change. When we're immersed in something, we've been thinking about it and working on it for a while, we make the mistake very often of overestimating the level of understanding that those who haven't been as involved as we have. Many change experts recommend doing what might feel to you like over-explaining to those who will be impacted by the change. Very often when we get to the point as a leader of a change that we feel like we just can't talk about it one more time, we're just scratching the surface of what people need. I'm just now seeing, sorry Kristen, I'm just now seeing your comment that journaling helps connect the rational and emotional side of the brain. That's an excellent point, and that's a really good tool for kind of laying it all out there. And there's all kinds of research about the impact that just identifying emotions that we're feeling can have on the way that, on our emotions down the road. So really laying that out and putting it out on paper can really change the way that you feel about things, and it can create a lot more self-awareness, which then gives you something to base your decisions on going forward about how you want to respond. Excellent point. Thanks, Kristen. So we've looked at some input. We've looked at understanding. There are two more differences that kind of on the surface can feel like no-brainers, but there's more to them than meets the eye. One is the nature of the change. So the no-brainer part of it is that the process of change tends to be less stressful if it's perceived by the other person as minor, is additive rather than subtractive, so the person gets something rather than losing something, is initiated by the person, him or herself, rather than imposed by some external person or entity. But the more than meets the eye part is the word perceived. So it's all about the perception of the person. So what we perceive as a minor change, like getting a new office chair, might actually be perceived by someone else as a major change. So it's really important to be thinking about the perspective of the people involved because it may be perceived very differently than you're thinking about things. And then there's the area of impact that the change will have. So let's take a look at a few ways that we can define different types of impact. In the 80s, there was a researcher named Noel Tichy, and he developed a way of classifying the types of impact that change can have on a given person. So there have been a lot of researchers who have built on his theory since then, and it's really become a valuable tool for helping others while a change is in progress. So let's take an example that one of you gave that was referenced on the slide earlier. So at least one of you had plans to increase the capacity of a hospital lab department to provide some components of a med lab tech or a med tech program. So let's think a little bit about the impact this would have on a specific existing lab technician. So say there's a really knowledgeable, personable lab tech you think would be just the perfect person to do some hands-on teaching. And when he first hears about the proposal, he might be wondering about the technical aspects. Does he know enough about the job to teach other people? He's never taught before. Does he even have the skills to be a teacher? Will some of his workload be shifted to other lab techs so he has time, which is a valuable resource to teach and to mentor? He could be thinking about the political aspect, so his power and influence. If he's an instructor or a preceptor, it might give him a higher status in the group. Is that a good thing for him? Will other people resent him if he takes the role on? Could the change affect his union job class or his seniority in the department? Or he could think about the cultural aspect. So how would his role connect? How would this new role connect with his values? If he's someone who values giving back, he might be thrilled to be asked to be an instructor or a preceptor. If he's someone who prides himself, on the other hand, on getting things done and getting patients in and out quickly, he might really struggle to slow down and take time to teach others. So again, something that seems fairly straightforward has a lot of nuances to it. Let's think again. I'm going to go back to the original example that you all gave. Pull up one more poll question. So you identified a change. You identified a person that you felt was stuck. Which of those three areas would you say is the biggest concern for him or her? And acknowledging that very often it's more than one. But I'll just ask you to think of the primary one. Where right now we've got unanimous cultural aspect. And we're adding a technical. So it can be, sometimes it can be really helpful to think about this division, not because they're unique and they stand alone and people can't be affected by more than one, but there might be some different strategies for dealing with the different aspects, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. Thank you for your responses. So we've got 4 cultural and 1 technical. Sometimes the cultural can be the most challenging to overcome. I mean, whenever you're talking about values and mindsets, those can really present some significant challenges. Okay, so like I said, we'll come back to some specific strategies for dealing with each one of these in a minute. Right now I want to just kind of finish looking at where some of the sources of differences in the way that people react to change can come from. So we've talked about external characteristics, so things outside the person, but let's talk a little bit about personal characteristics. So I'm sure you're aware, you're all people who have a lot of change initiatives under your belt, but the reaction that someone has to a given change generally depends not only on circumstances around them or outside them, but also characteristics of the person, him or herself. Sometimes people's reactions can be impacted by their past experience with the topic. They may have more or less experience, or they may have had a negative experience. For example, if you're working on building a coalition, and one of your stakeholders has been burned in the past by someone they were working to collaborate with, this person might really view collaboration as a risk that they may not be willing to take. And that's not easy to overcome. There are also some underlying personality traits that lead to people being more or less comfortable with new experiences or with ambiguity and being more prone to anxiety than others. And in a minute, we'll talk about how to work with these differences, but there's one really important thing I want to point out before we move on, and that's something called the fundamental attribution error. The fundamental attribution error is a psychological principle supported by decades of research, and what we know is that human beings tend to attribute other people's behaviors to who they are rather to the situations that they're in. But we attribute our own behavior the opposite way. So we explain our own behavior due to the situation rather than who we are. So for example, we're changing software. So this change is being done to me. There's a new software coming that I'm really not happy with. And I might justify my resistance as saying, I'm not in favor of changing the software because nobody asked for my department's input, and the software that was chosen really doesn't do what we need. However, if I have a coworker who is resistant to a software that I have chosen, I may not attribute it to the situation, but I would tend to attribute it to a personality trait of hers. So she doesn't want to change software systems because she just can never handle anything new. Two very different ways to look at struggling with a change. And we tend to attribute our own struggle with change to the circumstances out of our control, and other people's trouble with change to their own personality faults. So it's just something to be aware of as people responsible for leading change, that we have this tendency. So in the context of what we're talking about today, that means that when we have people who aren't as excited about a proposed change as we are, we tend to first jump on attributing this lack of enthusiasm to a personal trait. She's stubborn, he's just anxious about everything, rather than anything in the environment. The good news is that as somebody leading change, you have a lot of influence over the way people experience the change. Personality traits may play a role, but it's actually quite a small role. You just have to figure out how to set up the environment and help people with the things we just talked about in a way that taps into what's important and what's right for them. The bad news is that, I'm sure you know, this is not easy. Anytime that we're paying attention to individual people and modifying our approach to really meet the needs of each individual person, it can get really complicated really fast. So, given all this, what can we do to set up the environment in ways that can help others navigate the change process? Let's go back to our rider and our elephant analogy just for a second here. So remember that the rider represents logic and reason, and the elephant represents emotions. To help other people with change, you've got to think about both the rider and the elephant. The rider does the planning, you may remember, and the elephant provides the energy. We're going to look at some strategies for targeting both, but we're probably a bit more heavily weighted toward the elephant. Plus we get better pictures when we talk about elephants. More exciting. So let's go back to the change curve for a minute and talk about some things you can do when individual people are at different spots on the change curve. When someone's in denial, you'll hear them saying things like, this is never going to happen, this is just the flavor of the month, it's all eventually going to go away, or my needs are totally different than everyone else's and this just won't work for me. The first thing to do is to listen to what they're saying. Is it true that their needs are totally different? If so, are there any adjustments that you can make to accommodate their needs? The flavor of the month comment, in my experience, gives you a little bit of insight into their past experience. So very often this means they've been disappointed by change efforts in the past, but a lot of effort into things that didn't end up sticking around. And it's important to understand that that's what you're up against. You're up against some experiences that were less than positive. That being said, there are a few things you can do when someone's stuck in denial. One is to have a really honest conversation. So in the case of the electronic health record, this is really happening, and here's why. In the network development group, some grantees struggle with a few folks who resist collaboration because they think the transition to value in healthcare isn't really going to happen, that things will eventually go back to the way they were. And they've had to have some pretty candid conversations with these people to make the case for why the odds of that happening are pretty slim, and what the impact will be if work isn't done to lay the groundwork for the transition to value. Because people who are stuck in denial often don't have a very good grasp of what the end goal will look like or have a very good understanding of the reason for the change, it can also be really helpful to reiterate why the change is being proposed. So what impact will it have on quality, or whatever else it is that the change is targeting, and to really spell out the vision for what things will look like in the end. Very often denial is just a lack of understanding of the end goal and the big why. Some Sometimes anger can show up really overtly by raised voices, angry facial expressions like the guy on this slide, and comments like, do you realize how much work this is going to create for me, or there's no way we can do this in such a short period of time. But sometimes it can be more subtle, like just not showing up for meetings or speaking negatively about the project outside the group. But either way, when someone is stuck here, you can again have some honest conversations where you acknowledge what's difficult. And again, because these should always be two-way conversations, listening to their point of view, making adjustments wherever you can, and affirming your support, whether that involves giving them more time if possible or any other support that would help to address some of their concerns. You'll see again that communicating the vision is listed here because sometimes people get so bogged down in the details that it's hard to keep the end goal in mind. So reminding them of why you're going and why you're doing what you're doing. So it could be providing services that currently aren't available in your area, improving patient care, and a lot of the things that you all talked about in the ALE programs meeting. It can also be helpful to ask others who do support what you're doing to have some conversations with people who are stuck in the anger phase and share their perspective. You're part of a collaborative group, so you don't have to be the only one working to influence other people. If you've got people in the bargaining phase, you'll hear things like, well, I could have done this if these conditions had existed, or if this tweak was made, I may be able to do it. This is actually a really good sign that the person is moving along the curve. So I would, if as a leader, you can take this as encouragement. And it's even possible that you'll bypass the next stage on the curve, which is depression altogether, and skip right to acceptance if you can adjust the plan and kind of work with their bargaining. Sometimes their bargaining chip is just a little bit more time or more resources, and if that's doable and you're able to implement some suggestions that they have, you can move them right along the curve and skip depression altogether. Again, acknowledging that things don't move quite as neatly as it looks on this curve. That being said, so here we are at depression. People at this stage need support. They need time to process. It can help if they know that you know they're having a hard time and to let them know that you're there to help in any way that you can. Time is very often the remedy for someone who is sort of stuck in this part of the curve. But don't forget the trapdoor of despair. There is a risk of people leaving at this point. So it's important to be paying close attention and providing some extra support if this is something that you really don't want to happen. If you've got people who've reached acceptance, be really careful. This is obviously a good thing, but just be careful not to check them off the list and move on. Remember that we can slide back and forth on this curve. So it's important to keep checking in to see how things are going with them, keep them engaged in the process. One great way to keep people who have reached this end of the curve is to keep them involved with bringing others along. So if you've got people farther behind, these people who are here can be really great advocates. This is especially true if they've walked in the shoes of someone who's at an earlier stage along the curve. If this person is a physician, for example, I just had this conversation yesterday with a network leader. So this guy, a physician who has worked through some of the same things that another physician is still really struggling with. They may be able and willing to share their experience with the person who's still struggling. As we all know, sometimes the most powerful messages can come from people who used to be where you are. Again, these examples are pretty simplified. The way we experience change isn't always tied up in this nice, neat bow or this nice curve. But it's been shown through lots of research as a pretty valid illustration of the big picture experience of change. And it can be a helpful way to think about other people who are going through it with you. So those are some strategies for helping people at different parts of the curve. Let's look a little bit at strategies for helping people who are being impacted primarily by these three different areas: technical, political, and cultural aspects of change. There's a worksheet that goes along with this webinar that's down kind of on the bottom of the screen, that leading change in the files pod. So it's just a tool for you to think through if you really want to get intentional about helping one or more people that is involved in your change. That worksheet has sort of a framework for you to think through these different areas of impact and come up with some strategies for helping them through it. So let's say you've got someone who's really angry, doesn't seem to be moving along the curve. It can be helpful then to add this in, this technical, political, cultural view of change, and think about which of these is the primary sticking point, like you all just did in the poll question. Is it a technical issue where they're concerned they don't know enough or they don't have the resources they need? If so, here are some strategies. You can provide education to address the knowledge issue. You can ensure that enough time is allotted to learn. Time is a really valuable resource and part of the technical aspect. And again, these should always be two-way conversations. So what kind of resources are they saying they need, and what are you capable of giving to them? And being patient, again, just allocating some time for people to process. Is it political? Are they stuck in the political aspect where they have a lot of power or influence in the way things are currently, but they have concern about losing it when the change occurs? This is something when you think about building a coalition or many changes at work, because a lot of us feel we bring value by the amount of influence that we have in the workplace. A lot of changes have a significant political aspect to them for people. So this is a really important one to consider. Some strategies for helping people who are struggling with the political aspect is to have some honest discussions about roles, responsibilities, accountability, to acknowledge the changes that will be happening and what will be different for them in the new situation. But then to help identify ways that they'll continue to bring value and influence. So even though, for example, software is a nice, easy example to use. You're changing software, somebody who's really knowledgeable in that software values themselves because they can help other people with it. If you're changing software, that's removing a source of value for them. And so to help them identify some ways that they can continue to bring value to the organization. Is it a cultural change where there's a possible mismatch between the values of the person or the way things have always been done in the new way? And if so, you can really have some good conversations to help them tie their values to the values of the organization and to clarify the misalignment. So let's really look at what's different between the way things are currently and the way things are in the environment and what we need to do differently to get those in line with each other so that people really understand why things are being done. When you identify the specific category of concerns or the specific areas of resistance that people might have, not only do you identify some specific ways to address them, but it can also help us feel a little bit more empathy for those people that are impacted by the change, which can then impact your own feelings about the person, which can then help you build a stronger relationship and have more influence. It all kind of snowballs. So those are kind of some ways to help address more of those aspects outside the person. Let's look at ways to address those personal characteristics. So people with less experience with the topic or a negative experience need a lot more support. They need a lot of time to absorb information, time to adapt. They need more direct support. Sometimes we call that hand-holding. So to really help them through the process on a very individualized basis. People who are less comfortable with ambiguity tend toward being more anxious during change, and they need as much detail as you can possibly give them. So share a very well-defined plan, make sure they clearly understand where you're going, what's the end vision, what is the process going to look like, what are the milestones along the way, and then just for you to be checking in with them frequently to help give them direction, help give them detail as needed. If you're a leader who is very comfortable just trying things and seeing what happens, but you've got some people who work with you who are less less comfortable that way, it's important to really be considering their perspective and thinking about what they need. And as always, I just want you to keep in mind here, one is that when we're immersed in something, as I said before, we tend to develop this illusion that other people understand it as well as we do. When you think about it, when you're responsible for implementing something new, you spend a lot of time on the front end. You're gathering input, you're leading discussions, you're putting together strategic goals and timelines, and then you bring other people into the loop when you're kind of ready, already kind of well along that change curve yourself. And we sometimes forget that often when we're ready to have the rubber meet the road, other people are just getting used to the idea that something new is about to happen. So I really encourage you to have patience, have empathy with people, and to use some of the strategies we've talked about today to help them through the process. The other one, something I've already said, but I want to reiterate it because it plays such a humongous role in our responses to other people as we're leading them through change, and that's the fundamental attribution error. So the next time you find yourself thinking, oh, that's so-and-so, there she goes again, just being her difficult self, think about our tendency to attribute others' behavior to their difficult, and making air quotes, personality traits, and just remind yourself that there are probably some external factors at play that you could address, and most likely something that you would have some control over. So speaking about thinking about how we're thinking about things, let's talk before we go about managing our own emotions during the change process. When you're leading a change, you're not only responsible for paying attention to other people's elephants, but now you've also got your own to manage. The positive emotions we experience when we're leading a challenging project give us a lot of momentum toward our goal. So we feel energized. That means that our riders and our elephants are aligned. So our emotions are driving us in the direction our rational side is aiming for. But when we feel frustrated, or we feel angry, or we feel demoralized, which if you've ever been through a change, you've probably felt those feelings, and it can be difficult to keep working toward that end vision in those situations. We tend to get sidetracked, we stop moving altogether, so our elephant is now out of alignment with our rider. I'm sure you've all experienced some of these during your work on these projects, and you've still reached your goals, and you've made significant impact in your communities, so I know that you've all had success managing your own elephants. But I'm just going to share a few tips that could be helpful the next time you feel like your elephant is moving away from the direction you'd like. The first thing you can do is to honor your elephant. That means that when you recognize when you're feeling frustrated or you're feeling de-energized, and you recognize it without judging yourself. Easier said than done. But sometimes when you identify how you're feeling, and Kristen's suggestion of journaling is a fabulous way to do this. You can maybe connect it to a spot on the change curve. So on those days when you're feeling really demoralized, if you've just run into one too many roadblocks, for example, you can approach it the same way you would if you were helping someone else experiencing a change. So feeling demoralized might mean you're in the dip of depression on the curve. What do we do when someone else is there? We give them time, we express support. So on a demoralizing day, you can manage your own elephant by acknowledging how you're feeling, giving yourself space to feel that way, and then just giving yourself time to gather yourself back together and give it another go. Dr. Susan David is a faculty member in Harvard Medical School. She has done a lot of research on emotional intelligence and wrote a recently published book called Emotional Agility. And she found that when we give ourselves permission to feel what we're feeling, the feeling actually goes away more quickly than if we fight it or if we try to keep it bottled up. So if you let yourself feel disheartened without judging yourself for it, you'll fairly quickly regain your energy to keep fighting that good fight. And just like when you're thinking about other people who are stuck at a certain spot on the curve, when you're stuck, You can also think about the technical, political, and cultural aspects and how they're impacting you. So are you unsure about what to do next because you need more knowledge? So that's the technical aspect. This one's pretty straightforward. You can do research. You can learn from someone else. You can do what it takes to get the knowledge that you need. Are you stuck because you're feeling like your values aren't aligned with your work? For example, if it's really important to you to connect with other people through your work, but you're finding yourself stuck behind a computer for 8 hours a day, maybe you can find a way to make changes to tap into what's important to you. Whatever that is, you'll get your elephant kind of going in the right direction if you can acknowledge those emotions and address them in a way that works. Then there are the times we really get stuck. You know, those days when you're just feeling sorry for yourself, or you can't quite shake your anger or your frustration with a process or a person. We've all had those days. Maybe it's even longer than a day, but when that's the case, what can you do then? When we're really feeling emotionally hooked by something we just can't get past, Susan David says it's often due to the story that we've created for ourselves to explain the situation. For example, my boss isn't supporting me because she's power hungry. She just likes to randomly exert power. This leads to some pretty emotional reactions, as you can imagine, when that's the story that you've created. The problem is that there's not a whole lot you can do about a power-hungry boss. So if you take a step back and create one or more alternative stories, you might feel a little bit more empowered. So one possible alternative story about your boss could be that she's not supporting you because you haven't effectively explained your position yet, or she's not supporting you because she's under a lot of pressure from her boss and her focus right now is somewhere else. But regardless of which one of these is true, selecting an alternative story that you can actually do something about can really change the way you feel about this situation. It can help you get your emotional elephant more in line with your rational rider. And here's my final tip, and it's a concept that was commonly used in one of my previous companies. It started when we talked about safety on the job, but then it kind of morphed into conversations about wellness and conversations about conflict at work. So this concept is rooted in a lot of key concepts in psychology related to how we see the impact we have on our surroundings. Anyway, so the idea goes like this. If you roughly think that in any given situation we control only about half of what happens to us, like when we're driving, we can't control the weather, we can't control other drivers, but we can control whether we wear a seatbelt, whether we obey speed limits, whether we pay attention. So when we focus on the things that we can't control, like how other people are reacting, how other people are driving, some tight deadlines, other people's personality traits, our elephant can get away from us. The way to keep your elephant going in the right direction is to focus on the 50% that we can control. Like in the context of change, taking the time you need to fully understand things, checking in with people to see how they're doing, a lot of the other strategies that we talked about today. And when you're really feeling like you're in a funk, take a minute and ask yourself, what's my 50% here? So what are the things in this situation that I do have control over? You'll be amazed at how this really can redirect your thinking and your emotions and can get you back on track. And there's all kinds of really interesting research on the brain about how asking your brain a question can completely redirect your thinking and your behavior. That's my last tip. That's the end of my slides. There's some really great resources here. Susan David's book on emotional agility is a really good one. There are other great books. A great podcast, Daniel Kahneman is an expert on behavioral economics. He's very entertaining to listen to. If you have the opportunity to check him out, I would highly recommend it. So now I'll just throw it out. Are there any questions, any additional thoughts, any words of wisdom, any questions that you have? If you do, you can type them in the chat box on the lower left corner. right, seeing no questions, I will turn it back over to Angie.
Thank you, Shannon. Yeah, as Shannon said, if you have any questions, please feel free to unmute your phone line and ask a question or type it in the chat box. As you're completing the evaluation, I would like to remind you of some upcoming events. Let's see, July 25th, we have our final call together as a group. It is a peer group call, and we will be doing some celebrations and talking about some close-up procedures.